welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gruss at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you. And so, today I'm going to be covering alternative forages. And so just a real quick overview, what I'm going to be covering is really focusing on some of the background and like filling the gaps, what we typically see as our forage gaps throughout the year, what we can do. And I'm really going to be talking a lot about what a lot of people consider as cover crops, thinking about those annual forage potentials. Some ways we can start thinking about incorporating them, and then just some final thoughts to bring it all together. And so this is a typical relative growth chart for cool season pastures in Iowa. And so Iowa is predominantly cool season pastures. And so we get really good forage production throughout the spring. We go through that summer slump. And then in that fall, we start to see more forage production again. And then we have what's wonderfully our wonderful winters. And so we have some forage gaps in the winter time frame and that summer slump. And so what can we do? Typically, as we've talked before, if we set our stocking rates at what we see in the springtime, we're going to have to destock for summertime because we're not going to have enough forage. Or we could be, and then we're also going to have to feed stored feed throughout the winter. So thinking about stored feed, destocking, if we're setting our stocking rates at that springtime forage production. Or we could be feeding hay to keep the animals that we have. Cattle are priced well right now, so maybe we don't want to destock and try to keep feeding them out throughout the summer. Or we can also set a lower stocking rate in general. So we can set it at that summer slump time frame. So we just have a lower stocking density to start with. And we could potentially be haying the excess forage in that spring time frame, setting up for stockpile in the fall. Now, this is if we are relying on just our cool season pastures. And we've talked a lot about how we can manage those cool season pastures with rotational stocking systems to hopefully maximize production and also keep the persistence of these pastures for longer. But what can we do to start filling those gaps and using alternative forages to do that? And one of the big ones that I always think of is those warm season grasses that produce really well, or just warm season forages in general that produce really well during the summertime and can help fill that summer slump time period so that we're able to hopefully continue stacking at a little bit higher rate and just filling that summer slump, or potentially just making sure we have more forage for later. And then additionally, another great opportunity is winter annual cover crops. Winter annual cover crops, or just some of our cool season cover crops, we can start planting those in the fall period or late summer, getting production potentially further into the fall or earlier in the spring. And so through diversification, adding different alternative forages, we can really start thinking about how we can fill those gaps in forage production to hopefully graze for longer, because grazing is one of our cheaper forage options, and it can be really great to have extending those grazing days. And so what can we add? What can we use? And so this is just kind of a quick chart looking at different cover crop options that we typically talk about. And those cool season cover crops, those spring oats, annual ryegrass, we have winter triticale. The most common would be our cereal rye. And our cereal rye is a great option. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. Then we have some legumes that are some pretty good options as well, that are going to grow well going into the fall, or if we plant those early in the spring. And then lastly, our broadleaf forbs, such as turnips, kale, or radishes, generally quick growers. And why I like to think about these annuals is a lot of times they're very fast establishers, and so we can get some forage pretty quickly. And then we have our warm season cover crops that we can start to be thinking about filling that summer slump with. And then sorghum, with those sorghum species, millets, we have some cowpeas, sun hemp, all these different opportunities that can help start filling that summer slump period. And when we're typically talking about a lot of these alternative forages, as an opportunity, typically this is going onto land that's used for probably grain production. So a lot of people like to call these cover crops. Is there another goal that you're having that in the rotation for your grain production? Are we hoping to get more spring growth? And so if we're looking at spring growth and we're planting in the fall, is it going to survive winter? What animal classes are you grazing? And then what are you planting following it potentially? All those things should be considered as you're looking at these alternatives. But I'm really focusing on this as a grazing tool in this presentation. And one thing I always like to kind of just talk about a little bit so that we have a better understanding of why we have that summer slump and why our warm seasons do so well. And it's really just, it's this, it's the photosynthesis they go through. And basically C3 plants, such as that cereal rye, oats, crimson clover, and then most of our cool season pastures throughout Iowa, they have a photosynthesis that's called C3. And what happens is if you follow this, this is the photosynthetic rate. So the faster the rate, the faster these plants can grow. Is at lower temperatures, they do better than our warm seasons, which are these C4 plants. But as temperatures rise, basically our coolest seasons go through this process that's inefficient called photorespiration. Not going to go into completely why that happens, but our photosynthetic ability of those plants basically plateau and start to decline as temperatures continue to rise. Where C4 plants, they can have a lot larger of a threshold and start to photosynthesize at a much quicker rate during those summer months. And so when we talk about our warm season annual plants, some of these plants, we could be planting them and within 40 days be grazing them. And they just have such a fast rate. But why we really can start feeling that summer slump is with these warm seasons, because they can handle that heat very well. A lot of them are also very drought tolerant too. But just wanted to show that to kind of give you a reason of why these differences are seen. And why when we start thinking about, maybe we are thinking about planting oats, we may be wanting to plant that early spring or late summer going into the fall instead of maybe into June, July, when we really should be thinking about a tough or sorghum Sudan grass type grass. And then one last thing I wanted to talk about before we dive into thinking about the integration of these alternatives is the versatility of these. I really like thinking about our cover crops and those warm season annuals and those cool season annuals for their versatility. Grazing is the focus of today's presentation, but there is a lot of variability that we can have. And I know each of us have probably seen that our weather is not normal anymore, and we see a lot of variation from year to year. And so we always have our plan A, but we should have plan B and C as well. And a lot of these crops are very versatile in that way. And we can if we initially thought we were going to be grazing it, but we have a large onset of cool season grasses that year and we don't need to graze it, we could chop it for silage instead or baleage. And then potentially letting it grow out and stockpiling it for later. And so just really the versatility of these are a great opportunity to really use these in a lot of different ways. And so now we're going to dive into how we can integrate these into our systems. And what I'm going to go over is just some ways that I've done throughout my research, but there's a lot of opportunities here and just thinking about it and being creative. And so traditionally, when we think about integrating warm season annuals, we'll have two fields. So this is going to represent our cool season pastures. And you're going to see a similar chart to this throughout the rest of this presentation. So we always typically will be looking at two different fields. We'll have our cool season perennial pasture, and then we'll have another field that we'll be planting some of these warm seasons too. So this is like a traditional thought. We start grazing those cool seasons late April, early May. We can graze those into June, and then right around June, where it really starts to heat up, we can start to be thinking about moving over to the warm season pastures. So the warm season annuals would have been planted in late May, early June. We could be having about 30, 40 days of growth giving that opportunity for them to establish well. And then we can be going into them to start grazing early July throughout August, and then going back into those cool seasons after they've had that rest throughout that time period, where previously we had discussed how as we're thinking of rotations during this time, we're thinking of really slow rotations, giving those plants as much rest as possible to ensure that they're able to recover during those high heat months. Next, there's other opportunities. These things, it's kind of time to be creative. I like to think about. So we have that traditional setup that we just saw previously, but a lot of times, just because our warm seasons are not growing as well in August, we could be they still continue to grow. So if we don't terminate them, there's an opportunity that we could potentially be grazing them once or twice throughout that July, August timeframe, going back to our cool seasons. And while they're there, until we get to a killing frost, we could be stockpiling these to graze them for later. And so this is a trial that we did in central Iowa. And this one, we did just harvest it with a harvester. And so there is a little difference there, but just wanted to show you kind of some of the things we saw. And so our summer annuals, we had pearl millet and sorghum Sudan grass in this. And throughout the summer in 2024 and 2025, we got about 2.5 to up to 6 tons per acre for these summer annuals and throughout those 2 cuttings. And then we basically, after that second cutting in late August, we just allowed it to regrow until killing frost in November. And so after we rested it for that period, and so this would be the period that the animals had gone back to those cool season pastures, we allowed it to rest, and then we came back to see how much more accumulation these plants were able to have. And we were up to 1.4 to 2.6 extra tons per acre, allowing those plants just to regrow throughout that September and October period. And so summer annuals could be a great opportunity in that sense. And then what other opportunities do we have? And so as we're thinking about this, setting it up, we could potentially just graze these instead of going back to those cool seasons in early September, potentially those warm seasons. And a lot of this is going to depend on our weather, of course. Maybe we should just be thinking about haying our cool seasons and setting them up for stockpiling. We do have that concern of prussic acid in those sorghum Sudan grasses typically as we go later into the fall with those cool season frosts. So maybe just grazing our warm seasons until they're completely tapered out will give us an opportunity to stockpile our cool season pastures instead. And so this is another trial that was done in central Indiana. And we basically started grazing in July and we stopped grazing in September 22nd. And we wanted to see, basically, we wanted to graze it as long as we possibly could up until a frost had occurred. And we were able to see that yields were very consistent throughout the grazing period. The start was a little low, but that was just because we started. And then when we started, we used 24 inches as our starting point, and those plants continued to grow. And so what we can see, and we rotated through this pasture. And so if we're following like the red boxes, that means we went back to that pasture at this point, or that paddock at this point. And so we were able to graze paddocks 2 to 3 times throughout this period. And we were able to get really good productivity throughout the season. And so these plants, like I mentioned previously, even though they grow best during the summer, typically they will continue to grow as we go into those later months. Again, it will depend a bit on what our temperatures look like. But they can typically hold value for a fairly long time. During this trial, we were able to get stocker gains at about approximately 2 pounds per day. So respectable gains throughout the summer, good quality feed. And so just really thinking about the versatility of these. And ideally in that situation, you'd be able to then you could stockpile those cool season grasses and set yourself up for winter. And this is just some information on what a study that was done in Wisconsin and how it potentially could match up to what we were just talking about, and giving them that extra 60 days of growth prior to a frost. And so with that, you can see different forages species do have different impacts on that frost. Tall fescue is typically one of our best stockpilers. But if we can get an additional 1 to 2 tons of dry matter heading into winter, we could have considerable more grazing days as we're going out. And so every day that we can keep grazing, we can hopefully be putting our costs down instead of relying on that stored feed. And then next, we're going to kind of talk about integrating those winter annuals. And so traditionally, I always think about winter annuals as that cover crop following grain production. So this is just that field that would be in grain production. If we're harvesting soybeans or corn, we're really thinking about a late planting date. And this is where that cereal rye really comes in. We're typically trying to use that growing season as much as possible to get the best grain yields we can. And so when we have that, cereal rye is one of our few that can really establish well and still come in the spring. And so this would be looking at planting a winter annual, moving into fall. Typically, we don't get much biomass production in the fall because of that long grain production window. And then we come in, or hopefully earlier in the spring, and we can start grazing that winter annual for a couple weeks to a month prior to going on to those cool season pastures. And so it can fit into there well. If we have silage production, we might be able to establish our fall cover crops sooner. And so we may be able to use like a winter kill cover crop, such as oats, those brassicas, and get a month or so of growth, and then be able to graze that fall cover crop a little earlier. Or again, we could be focusing on those winter annuals to be able to graze in the springtime. And then one other thing that could really fit well is those grain production and silage production. We typically try to push those seasons as much as possible so we can get as much yield as possible. A lot of our warm seasons, like I mentioned, we can get those growing fairly quickly and fairly early. There is the potential of a summer annual, winter annual rotation to really hopefully push our yields. And so planting that warm season again, late May, early June, grazing that July through August, going back to those cool season pastures. But after grazing it, terminating it, and going straight into a winter annual, we could really start to push yields and earlier grazing in the spring as well. So we're helping fill that summer slump, and we're starting to think about earlier grazing in the spring. It is an intensive rotation, but it can turn out well. And or potentially we could be also looking at planting that cool season annual grass, especially if we're going to stop grazing early. But like I was going to mention, this warm season, winter annual rotation can turn out well. So this trial was done up in northeast Iowa at the Nashua farm. And what we can see here is that depending on where we are, our winter annuals were attributing an average of 2 tons per acre when there was 50 pounds of nitrogen applied. And our warm seasons had an additional 4.5 tons per acre using a rotation like this. Now, again, this was chopped and not grazed specifically, but it's just kind of showing you how this rotation could potentially work. But overall, this rotation was able to give an additional 6 to 7 tons of dry matter per acre. So really good opportunity to potentially expand our forage production. And so real quick, just some final thoughts on this, because these are cover crops. One thing I like to just kind of mention is how does grazing impact soils and cover crop production? And this is from a meta-analysis that was done. And they really wanted to just see, okay, if we do decide to take one field out of production and put it into these annual forages, what happens? And compaction wise, they did see some increase in compaction on some of the fields, but there were very few cases that were over this 2 megapascals, which that basically means that the roots were not inhibited growth. Getting over this, that meant root growth could be inhibited, but below this value, we basically did not see root growth being inhibited. And typically when they did, it was at really high stocking rates and when it was grazed, when it was wet. So limited impact. There was no impact on water infiltration. So they still got really good water infiltration, whether it was grazed or not. If they did see, they saw increases and some decreases, but there was no consistent pattern. Total carbon. There were a few studies that found a decrease in soil organic carbon. They suspect that this might have been due to some high removal rates of the cover crop. but the majority of the studies saw grazing maintain soil organic carbon. And crop production wise, they saw no impact on yield, and most of the time there were a few increases and a few decreases, but these really varied among years. And so overall, I just wanted to kind of show that when we graze this right and we graze it well, we are not going to be impacting our grain crop following it. Real quick, some grazing strategies. I like to break these into will it regrow or will it not regrow? If we're wanting it to regrow, we really should be thinking of a rotational stacking system or even potentially mob grazing. We want a back fence. When it does not regrow, and these are things I think about that are winter killed, stockpiled, things like that, strip stacking, as Margaret Thomas talked about last week, could be a great option. The back fence is not needed because they're not going to be going back to graze stuff to the ground or because they're going to be going for that fresh forage that's you're opening it up to. Just wanted to mention grazing heights, leaving that residue behind, keeping those summer annuals. They really like a larger residue. And so we're looking at greater than 6 inches to make sure that they can regrow. Winter annuals, we can start grazing those down to that 3 to 4 inches that we talked about a lot for those cool season pastures. And just want real quick, some final thoughts before I pass it off to Greg. Is cover crops is a great way to maximize production. They're fast establishers. And when you're doing this, there's no set one rule fits all or one system's going to fit all. Let's be creative. We talked about this a lot during the rotational stocking sessions, that we can be flexible. It needs to fit in your system. And always be thinking about, are these going to be regrow? Do you want them to regrow? And making sure that we give them the ability to regrow if that is the case. And with that, thank you.